Poe was just 40 years old when he was found lying in the street outside of a tavern in Baltimore. He was taken to Church Home Hospital, where he died a few days later. Poe, who would become one of the most celebrated writers of that generation, lived in poverty. His fame came after he died.
When he sat down and picked up that pen, he created works of art. People from around the world know Edgar Allan Poe.
Edgar Allan Poe later moved to Baltimore and became known as a poet and famous mystery writer. And now Baltimore is honoring Poe's legacy.
1849, when one of America's most famous poets and writers, Edgar Allan Poe, died.
While I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping on my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping on my chamber door. Only this, and nothing more. Edgar Allan Poe was a writer, poet, author, editor, and critic. He is most known for his Gothic fiction as one of the country's earliest practitioners of the short story. He is also considered the inventor of the detective fiction genre and a contributor to the genre of science fiction, one of the most well-known American writers. Though he lived a financially difficult life, his life ended just like his stories, strange and macabre. His death is a great mystery that could have been played out in one of his short stories. Poe was born in Boston, Massachusetts on January 19, 1809, to actor David Poe Jr. and actress Elizabeth Arnold Hopkins Poe. He had an older brother, Henry, and a younger sister, Rosalie. His father abandoned the family in 1810, and his mother died of tuberculosis in 1811. Poe was taken in by John Allen, a successful merchant in Richmond, Virginia. He dealt in cloth, wheat, tombstones, tobaccos, and slaves. The Allens served as Poe's foster family and gave his name Edgar Allan Poe, but he was never formally adopted. Poe was spoiled by his foster parents, but also aggressively disciplined for bad behavior. The family moved to the United Kingdom in 1815. Poe attended grammar school in Scotland for a short time before returning to his family in London. He attended boarding school in Chelsea until the summer of 1817. Then he was entered into Bransbury Manor House School in a suburb of London. Poe, along with the Allens, moved back to Richmond in 1820. In 1825, John Allen's uncle William Galt died. He is said to be one of the wealthiest men in Richmond. He left Allen several acres of real estate and his inheritance, which was estimated at $750,000, around $19 million today. Poe registered at the University of Virginia in 1826 to study language. It is believed he may have become engaged to Sarah Elmira Royster, who was 15 at the time, but this ended while he was studying at the university after her father did not approve of their relationship. During his time at university, Poe became estranged from his foster father over gambling debts. He claimed Allen had not given him enough money to register for classes, purchase books, and get furniture for his dormitory. Allen did end up sending more money to Poe, but Poe's debts only increased. He quit university after only a year, and he did not feel welcome back in Richmond, especially since he learned his sweetheart Sarah had married another man. Poe moved back to Boston in April of 1827. He worked odd jobs as a clerk and a newspaper writer. He started using the pseudonym Henry Leigh Rennett. Poe was struggling in Boston, and he was unable to support himself, so he enlisted in the United States Army on May 27, 1827, under the name Edgar A. Perry. He said he was 22, but he was only 18 at the time. He served at Fort Independence in Boston Harbor for $5 a month. That same month, he released his first book, a 40-page collection of poetry titled Tamerlane and Other Poems. Only 50 copies were printed, and the book received almost no attention. Poe's regiment was posted to Fort Moultrie in Charleston, South Carolina. Poe was promoted and now prepared shells for artillery, and his monthly pay doubled. He served for 2 years and attained the rank of sergeant major for artillery, the highest rank that a non-commissioned officer could achieve. Poe wanted to end his 5-year enlistment early. He revealed his true name and his circumstances to his commanding officer, Lieutenant Howard, who would allow Poe only to be discharged if he reconciled with Allen. Poe wrote to Allen, who was unsympathetic and spent several months ignoring his pleas. Allen didn't even write back to make him aware that his foster mother had an illness. Frances Allen died February 8, 1829. Poe visited the day after her burial. Allen eventually agreed to support Poe's attempts to be discharged in order to receive an appointment at the United States Military Academy at West Point. Poe was discharged on April 15, 1829, after securing a replacement for his enlistment. Before entering West Point, he moved to Baltimore with his widowed aunt Maria Clem, her daughter Virginia Eliza Clem, his brother Henry, and his invalid grandmother Elizabeth Cairns Poe. That year he received a good review on his poetry. In his words, the very first words of encouragement I ever remember to have heard. John Neal wrote the good review, and Poe dedicated one of his poems to him in his second book, Alaraf, Tamerlane, and Minor Poems, in 1829. He went to West Point and became a cadet in 1830. In October, Poe's foster father married his second wife, Louisa Patterson. The marriage and bitter quarrels with Poe led to his foster father disowning Poe. He decided to leave West Point by purposely getting court-martialed. On February 8, 1831, he was tried for gross neglect of duty and disobedience of orders for refusing to attend formations, classes, or church. He chose to plead not guilty to induced dismissal, knowing that he would be found guilty. Poe headed for New York in February 1831. He released his third book, titled Poems. It was financed by fellow cadets who donated 50 cents each, raising $170, and included a page saying, "To the U.S. Corps of Cadets, this volume is respectfully dedicated." Poe returned to Baltimore. His brother had become ill due to problems with alcoholism. He died August 1st, 1831. After his brother's death, he made a more earnest attempt to start his career as a writer. He was one of the first writers to live by writing alone. Copyright laws hurt writers during this time. Instead of purchasing new works, American publishers often produced unauthorized copies of British works. Poe often resorted to humiliating pleas for money and other assistance to survive. Poe rejoined the Clem household in 1833. He was soon smitten by a neighbor, Mary Deverax. His first cousin Virginia served as a messenger between Poe and Mary. Elizabeth Cairns Poe died July 7th, ending the family income and making survival tough. Edgar Allan Poe took a liking to his young first cousin Virginia. This was taboo even for the time. In August 1835, Poe moved to Richmond and became assistant editor of the Southern Literacy Messenger. He was discharged only after a few weeks for being drunk on the job. While Poe was away, another cousin, Neilson Poe, husband of Virginia's half-sister Josephine, heard that Poe was considering marrying Virginia. Neilson offered to take Virginia in and educate her in order to prevent the girl's marriage to Edgar at such a young age. Edgar considered Neilson his bitterest enemy. He saw Neilson's actions as an attempt to break his connections with Virginia. This was true in the end. Edgar wrote a letter to Maria declaring he was blinded with tears and writing and pleaded that they allow Virginia to make her own decisions. Poe offered to provide financially for Maria, Virginia, and Henry if they moved to Richmond. He returned to Baltimore and marriage plans were confirmed. He filed for a marriage license on September 22, 1835. The couple might have been quietly married, but accounts are unclear. Their only public ceremony was in Richmond on May 16, 1836. They were married by a Presbyterian minister. Poe was 27 at the time and Virginia was 13, though her age was listed as 21 on the marriage bond. The marriage bond was filed in Richmond, included an affidavit from Thomas W. Cleveland confirming the bride's age as 21. Poe was reinstated as the assistant editor after promising good behavior. He returned to Richmond with Virginia and her mother. He stayed at the Messenger until 1837. In 1838, he relocated to Philadelphia. He lived at 4 different addresses from 1838 to 1844. Poe released the narrative of author Gordon Pym of Nantucket and was widely received. In 1839, he released Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque. He made little money from the book and received mixed reviews. Poe wrote for different magazines and he released a few different things after this. Poe tried to secure a position in the John Tyler administration, claiming he was a member of the Whig Party. He hoped to be appointed to the United States Customs House in Philadelphia, with help from President Tyler's son Robert, an acquaintance of Poe's friend Frederick Thomas. Poe failed to show up for the meeting with Thomas to discuss the appointment, claiming that he was sick, but Thomas thought that he was drunk. He never got the appointment. One evening in January 1842, Virginia showed the first signs of tuberculosis while sitting and playing the piano. Poe described she broke a blood vessel in her throat. She only partially recovered, and Poe began to drink more heavily. Poe returned to New York and worked at the Evening Mirror, then became editor of the Broadway Journal, and later its owner. On January 29, 1845, Poe's poem The Raven appeared in the Evening Mirror and became a popular sensation. It made Poe famous instantly. He was paid only $9 for this masterpiece and cult classic. It was published in the American Review, a Whig journal. The Broadway Journal failed in 1846. Poe moved to the Bronx in a cottage with his beloved Virginia. His beloved Virginia died in that cottage, January 30th, 1847, 5 years after her first symptoms of tuberculosis. 11 years after their wedding, she was 24, he was 38. Biographers and critics often suggest that Poe's frequent theme of death of a beautiful woman was because of the repeated loss of women throughout his life. Poe became increasingly unstable after Virginia's death. He attempted to marry poet Sarah Helen Whitman, but their engagement failed due to Poe's drinking, and most likely use of laudanum and his erratic behavior. There is evidence her mother intervened and convinced her daughter not to go through with the engagement. Poe returned to Richmond and resumed his relationship with his childhood sweetheart, Sarah Royster. Poe's visit was unannounced. Sarah later stated, "I was ready to go to church, and a student told me that a gentleman was in the parlor and wanted to see me. I went down and was amazed to see him, but knew him instantly." She had become deeply religious, and at this time she was 39, living with her 19-year-old daughter Anna and 10-year-old son Southall. This is how a friend described her. Her eyes were a deep blue, her hair brown, touched with gray, her nose thin, her voice was very low, soft and sweet, her manners exquisitely refined, and intellectually she was a woman of education and dollous of character. Her distinguishing qualities were gentleness and womanliness. Poe and Royster rekindled their relationship. Her children disapproved, and her dead husband's will stipulated that if she remarried, she would lose 3/4 of her estate. Poe hoped to be remarried before he left Richmond and asked for her response. She wanted time to consider. She might have been apprehensive because of the rumors of drunkenness and drug use and his rampant erratic behavior. It is unclear if the couple ever became engaged, but many agree they came to an understanding. Poe said goodbye and left Richmond. Sarah wrote on the evening of September 26th, "He was very sad and complained of being quite sick. I felt so wretched of him all that night that I went up early the next morning to inquire after him, when much to my regret he had left in the boat for Baltimore." Poe had stayed in Richmond from July to September to rekindle his relationship with Sarah and explore a possible magazine venture. He was suffering the effects of what he called a cholera attack, accompanied by hallucinations. Insistent that he had not been drinking, he recuperated and gave lectures and readings to pay his expenses. He left September 27th to head to New York. No reliable information exists of his whereabouts until a week later on October 3rd. He was found delirious on the streets of Baltimore at Ryan's Tavern. A printer named Joseph W. Whitaker found Poe outside the establishment, dressed in cheap stained clothing, not his usual black suit. The pub was being used as a temporary polling station at the time that Poe was found by Walker. A letter was sent by Walker to Joseph E. Snodgrass, an acquaintance of Edgar Allen Poe. It reads, "Dear Sir, there is a gentleman, rather the worse for wear, at Ryan's 4th Ward polls, who goes under the cognomen of Edgar A. Poe, and who appears in great distress. He says he is acquainted with you, and I assure you He is in need of immediate assistance. Yours in haste, Joseph W. Whitaker. Snodgrass later claimed that the note said that Poe was in a state of beastly intoxication. Snodgrass's first-hand account describes Poe's appearance as being repulsive. He had unkempt hair, a haggard, unwashed face, and lustrous and vacant eyes. His clothing included a dirty shirt with no vest, with unpolished shoes that were worn and did not fit well. Poe was taken to Washington College Hospital and treated by physician John Joseph Moran. He gave these details about Poe's appearance: a stained, faded old bombazine coat, pantaloons of similar character, a pair of worn-out shoes run down to the heels, and an old straw hat. Poe was not coherent long, and he was then able to explain how he came to be in this condition. It is believed that the clothes that he was wearing were not his own. Poe had always worn a suit and a vest. This outfit was out of character for him. Not to forget that the clothes did not fit well. There were no records of Poe booking an inn or purchasing any train tickets to New York, his intended destination. Poe's trunk with all of his belongings was found back in Richmond. It's hard to believe he could have forgotten everything in Richmond while boarding the boat to Baltimore. You'd think he would have noticed he had none of his belongings except the clothes on his back. Dr. Moran cared for Poe at Washington College Hospital on Broadway and Fayette Street. He was denied any visitors and was confined in a prison-like room with barred windows and a section of the building reserved for drunks. It is said that Poe repeatedly called out the name Reynolds the night before his death. No one has ever been able to confirm the identity of this person. One theory is that he was recalling an encounter with Jeremiah Reynolds, a newspaper editor and explorer who may have inspired the novel Poe wrote, the narrative of author Gordon Pym of Nantucket. Another theory is that Poe was referencing Henry R. Reynolds. He was one of the judges overseeing the Fourth Ward polls at Ryan's Tavern, the same place where he was found by Joseph Walker. It is believed that he may have met Poe. It was election day, and Henry Reynolds would have been at the tavern. The evidence Dr. Moran gives cannot be fully trusted, since he allowed no visitors to meet with Poe. He claimed he tried to cheer Poe up one of the few times that he was awake. Dr. Moran told Poe that he would soon be enjoying the company of friends. He stated Poe replied, the best thing that his friend could do would be to blow his out with a pistol. Another one of the few times Poe was awake, he made reference to his wife in Richmond. He may have been delusional during this time, thinking that his wife Virginia Poe was still alive, or he may have been referring to Sarah Royster, to whom he had recently proposed to. Poe did not know what happened to the trunk carrying all of his belongings, but as we know, it was later found at the Swan Tavern in Richmond, where Poe had been staying before he left on the boat for Baltimore. Moran said that Poe's final words were, "Lord help my poor soul," before he died on October 7th, 1849. Moran was probably the only person to see him during his last days. His credibility has been questioned repeatedly. Throughout the years after Poe's death, his story changed repeatedly as he wrote and lectured on the topic. He claimed in 1875, and again in 1885, that he had immediately contacted Poe's aunt and mother-in-law, Maria Clem, to let her know about Poe's death. In fact, he wrote her only after she had requested it, on November 9th, nearly a full month after the event had transpired. He had also claimed that Poe had said this as he prepared to draw his last breath: "The arched heavens encompass me, and God has his decree legibly written upon the frontlets of every created human being, and demons incarnate. Their goal will be seething waves of black despair." Rather poetic. The editor of the New York Herald, who had published the version of Dr. Moran's story, admitted that they cannot imagine Poe, even if he was delirious, constructing these sentences. Dr. Moran's account even altered the dates of which different things happened. He claimed that Poe was brought to the hospital on October 3rd at 5 p.m., on October 6th at 9 a.m., and on October 7th, the day that he had died, at 10 o'clock in the afternoon. Each time that he gave a different account, he claimed he had the hospital records to back them up. In a search for hospital records nearly a century later for an official death certificate, nothing was found. Every one of Poe's medical records, documents, and even his death certificate have been lost if they ever even existed. Poe's cause of death has been disputed, but of course, there are many theories. Different biographers have addressed the issue and have come to different conclusions. Jeffrey Myers believes it was hypoglycemia. John Evangelist Walsh has a murder plot theory. A train conductor named George Rollins said that Poe had boarded the train from Baltimore to Philadelphia. Upon arriving, he did not disembark and stayed on the train, which returned back to Baltimore. The train conductor thought Poe was being followed by two men. John Walsh believes that the two men were actually three brothers of Sarah Royster. They were to follow Poe in order to break off the engagement with their sister. John Evangelist Walsh says this after they arrived in Baltimore. As he left the depot, the three brothers tailed him, watching as he checked into the hotel. He had settled in his room when they again barged in. First there came a faint tap on the locked door. Then in response to Poe's weary question, perhaps a polite message, "Sir," as the door opened a crack, there came a sudden rush into the room. The brothers force-fed whiskey to Poe, forcing him to break off their engagement, threatening to ruin his reputation by spreading rumors of his relationship with Sarah Whitman, and of fathering an illegitimate child with Frances Osgood. Poe fought back, but was overpowered and forced to drink more alcohol, and in his stupefied state, they left him outside the tavern. This is what Walsh speculates. His evidence is based on Poe's missing mustache, Dr. Moran's testimony, and a similar theory in 1857. Another theory is Poe had overdosed on laudanum. Laudanum contains 10% powdered opium, dissolved into alcohol. In 1848, Poe nearly died from an overdose. Laudanum was prevalent back in the 1840s, used as a tranquilizer and painkiller. Snodgrass was convinced that Poe died from alcoholism. He was a supporter of the temperance movement and found Poe a useful example in his temperance work. Moran contradicted Snodgrass, saying Poe did not die while he was intoxicated, and claimed that Poe didn't even have the slightest odor of alcohol on his breath when he was brought in. Some newspapers reported Poe's death as congestion of the brain or cerebral inflammation, a euphemism for deaths involving alcoholism. A psychologist suggested that Poe suffered from dipsomania, a 19th century term for uncontrollable craving for alcohol, but this is disputed. One of Poe's drinking buddies, Thomas Reed, admitted that the two engaged in wild frolic. But Poe never went beyond the innocent mirth in which we all indulge. While acknowledging this is one of Poe's failings, I can speak truthfully of it not being habitual. He went months sometimes without a drink, and he was a member of the Sons of Temperance at the time of his death, a brotherhood that promoted the temperance movement in the 1840s. William Glenn, who administered Poe's pledge, wrote that he had no reason to believe that Poe had violated his pledge while in Richmond. It had been proven to be untrue that he died of an overdose. Numerous other causes of death have been promoted over the years, including several forms of rare brain disease, brain tumor, diabetes, enzyme deficiency, syphilis, hemorrhagic stroke, delirium, epilepsy, and meningeal inflammation. A doctor that examined Poe in 1848 believed he had heart disease. In 2006, a sample of Poe's hair were tested and provided evidence against lead poisoning, mercury poisoning, and any other toxic heavy metals. Cholera has also been suggested. Poe passed through Philadelphia in 1849 during a cholera epidemic. He got sick in the city and wrote to his aunt, Maria Clem, stating, he may have had the cholera or spasms quite as bad. One of the most popular theories is that Poe got caught up in a cooping scheme. Cooping was a form of electoral fraud in the United States, by which citizens were kidnapped off the streets and forced to vote, often several times for an election candidate. Election gangs working for a political candidate would hold random victims in a room, ply them with alcohol, or give them a face beating to get them to comply. Clothing would be changed to full voting officials and vote multiple times, or they would be given disguises such as fake wigs, fake beards, and even mustaches. Other forms of cooping would not involve voter fraud, but would rather be used on civilians to join the Union Army during the Civil War. Because Poe was found on Election Day outside the 4th Ward poll, some suggest that he was a victim of cooping. This theory began as early as 1872. This would also explain why Poe was different in dirty clothes and wearing shoes of the wrong size. This theory has become one of the most popular over the years. But Poe was well known in Baltimore. Many believe he would be too recognizable for this scam to actually work. In an analysis published in the Maryland Medical Journal in 1996 by cardiologist Michael Benetz, it is suggested that Poe's death could have been from rabies. Some of the signs that pointed to the analysis includes Poe's delirium. Also, Dr. Moran indicated that Poe having difficulty drinking water while he was hospitalized. Hydrophobia, or the fear of water, is a common symptom of rabies. But yet again, Dr. Moran contradicts himself in a later testimony, claiming that he had no difficulty drinking water while under his care. Poe's funeral was on October 8, 1849 in Baltimore. Poe's uncle, Henry Herring, provided the coffin, and his cousin, Nielsen Poe, supplied the hearse. Dr. Moran's wife made him a shroud. The funeral was presided over by Reverend W.T.D. Clem, cousin of Poe's wife, Virginia. Snodgrass was also in attendance. Elizabeth Herring and Joseph Clark. The ceremony lasted only 3 minutes, and Reverend Clem decided not to do a sermon because the crowd was way too small. Sexton George W. Spence wrote this about the weather. It was a dark and gloomy day, not raining, but just kind of raw and threatening. Poe was buried at the Westminster Presbyterian Churchyard in Baltimore in a cheap mahogany coffin without handles, a nameplate, cloth lining, or a cushion for his head. He was buried without a headstone in the rear corner of the churchyard near his grandfather. Nielsen Poe had bought him a headstone. Nielsen Poe had got him a headstone made from marble, but it was destroyed by a train derailment that had plowed through the monument yard where it was being held. Instead, he was given a sandstone block that had the number 80 written on it. In 1873, poet Paul Hamilton Hayne visited Poe's grave. He published a newspaper article describing its poor condition and suggested that an appropriate monument be erected. A schoolteacher, Sarah Sigourney Rice, took advantage of the new interest in Poe's gravesite and solicited funds. The money was raised, a monument was erected, and it was designed by George William Frederick and built by Colonel Hugh Sisson. It cost $1,500, around $38,000 today. Poe was reburied on October 1, 1875, at the new location close to the front of the church. The headstones on all of the graves were previously facing east, and they had been turned to face west in 1864. The reburial crew did not know this, and they had quite the difficulty in finding the right body. Unfortunately, they first exhumed a 19-year-old Maryland militiaman, Philip Mosher Jr. They got it right on the next attempt. They opened the coffin, and one witness noted this. The skull was in excellent condition. The shape of the forehead, one of Poe's striking features, was easily discerned. A few years later, his wife Virginia was moved to the spot. Unfortunately, the cemetery where she laid was destroyed, and she had no body to claim her remains. William Gill, a Poe biographer, gathered her bones and stored them in a box under his bed until her remains could be finally buried with her husband on January 19, 1885. Between 1949 and 2009, a bottle of cognac and 3 roses were left at Poe's original grave marker every January 19th by an unknown visitor, affectionately referred to as the Poe Toaster. So what killed Poe? It has been debated since his death, and it will probably never fully be known for sure. You have heard the theories and the evidence. What do you think happened? I'd like to know. Put them down there in the comments. That's the end of the story, and we shall quoth the raven, nevermore, nevermore.